My name is Emma. It all began when my family moved into a new house. We had been living in a small apartment in the city, and my parents decided it was time for a change. They wanted a bigger place with a yard where my little brother Ethan and I could play. After searching for a while, they found a house in a quiet neighborhood on the edge of town. The house was old, with large windows and tall creaking doors. It had been empty for a long time, which made it feel a bit lonely. But my parents loved it. They said it had character. They thought it would be a great place to make new memories. On the day we moved in, I was excited. I ran through the empty rooms, imagining how we would decorate them. My room was upstairs, at the end of a long hallway. It was a bit smaller than my old room, but it had a large window that looked out onto the backyard. I liked that. I could see the trees and the grass, and sometimes, if I was lucky, a bird would land on the windowsill. But there was something else about the room that I couldn't quite explain. It felt different, like the air was heavier, or like someone was watching me. I told myself it was just because the house was new to me, and I would get used to it soon. That first night in the new house, I had trouble falling asleep. The house made strange noises, creaks, groans, and soft taps. I tried to ignore them, telling myself it was just the house settling or the wind blowing through the trees outside. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds. My room was dark, except for a sliver of moonlight that came through the window. I could hear my parents talking downstairs and the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Everything seemed normal. But then, as the night grew quieter, I heard something different. It was a soft, whispering sound, like someone was talking very quietly. At first, I thought it was just my imagination. I tried to focus on the sound, but it was so faint that I couldn't make out any words. I pulled the blanket up to my chin and closed my eyes, trying to fall asleep. But the whispering continued. It seemed to be coming from somewhere in my room. I opened my eyes and looked around, but everything looked the same as before. There was nothing unusual, just my bed, my desk, and my dresser. I tried to convince myself that it was just the wind or the house making strange noises. But deep down, I felt uneasy. I finally managed to fall asleep, but my dreams were filled with strange, shadowy figures that whispered in the dark. The next day, I told my mom about the noises I heard during the night. She smiled and said it was probably just the house settling. "Old houses make noises like that," she explained. "You'll get used to it." I wanted to believe her, so I tried to put the strange sounds out of my mind. I spent the day unpacking my things and arranging my room the way I liked it. Ethan and I played in the backyard, and I started to feel more comfortable in the new house. But that night, the whispering returned. This time, it was a little louder, and it seemed to be closer. I could almost make out the words, but they were still too soft to understand. I sat up in bed, straining to listen, but the moment I moved, the whispering stopped. I got out of bed and walked to the window, hoping to see if something outside was making the noise. But the backyard was empty, and the night was still. I looked around my room, feeling a shiver run down my spine. The room felt cold, even though it was summer. That's when I noticed the shadows. They weren't the usual shadows that come from the furniture or the trees outside. These shadows seemed to move on their own, shifting and changing shape. They slithered across the walls and floor like they were alive. I blinked, thinking my eyes were playing tricks on me, but the shadows were still there. They moved slowly, almost like they were reaching for something or someone. I backed away from the window and climbed back into bed, pulling the covers over my head. I lay there, trembling, until I finally fell asleep. The next morning, I felt tired and scared. I didn't know how to explain what I had seen and heard, so I didn't tell anyone, not even Ethan. I thought maybe I was just imagining things and I didn't want to worry my parents. But the nights only got worse. Every time I turned off the lights, the whispering would start again. It grew louder each night, and soon I could hear a voice in the dark. It was soft and raspy, like someone speaking through clenched teeth. The voice said my name, "Emma, Emma." I would lie in bed, frozen with fear, listening to the voice call my name over and over. Sometimes it would ask me to come closer. "Emma, come here." I was terrified, but I didn't know what to do. I kept telling myself it was just a bad dream, but it felt too real. The shadows in my room would move and twist, growing darker and more menacing. They seemed to gather in the corners, watching me. One night, I couldn't take it anymore. I got out of bed and ran to my parents' room. I woke them up, crying and telling them about the voice in the shadows. My dad got up and checked my room, but he didn't find anything unusual. He told me it was just a nightmare and that I should try to go back to sleep. I tried to believe him, but the fear didn't go away. I stayed in their room that night, sleeping on the floor next to their bed. I thought maybe the voice and the shadows wouldn't follow me there, but I was wrong. A few days later, something happened that changed everything. My mom found an old journal while she was cleaning out the attic. It was covered in dust and looked like it hadn't been touched in years. The pages were yellowed and the handwriting was faded, but we could still read it. The journal belonged to a girl named Lily who had lived in the house many years ago. She wrote about her life, her family, and her friends, but as the journal went on, her writing became darker and more frantic. She wrote about hearing strange noises at night and seeing shadows in her room. Lily described the same whispering voice that I had been hearing. She said it called her name and asked her to come closer. She wrote about how the shadows seemed to follow her, growing stronger each night. She was terrified and didn't know what to do. The last entry in the journal was written in shaky handwriting. Lily said that the voice had finally spoken to her clearly. It told her that it was coming for her and that she couldn't escape. The entry ended abruptly, and there were no more pages after that. My mom and I read the journal together, and we both felt a chill. My mom tried to brush it off, saying it was just an old story, but I could see the fear in her eyes. She knew that what I had been experiencing wasn't just a nightmare. That night, I didn't want to sleep in my room. I begged my parents to let me stay with them, but they insisted that I needed to face my fears. They didn't want me to be afraid of my own room. So I reluctantly went to bed, feeling more scared than ever. As soon as the lights were out, the whispering began. But this time, it was different. The voice was louder, clearer, and angrier. "Emma, you can't hide." I pulled the covers over my head, trying to block out the sound, but it was no use. The voice seemed to be inside my head, echoing in my ears. I could hear the shadows moving around me, slithering across the floor and walls. They were closer than ever before. I felt something cold touch my foot, and I screamed. I jumped out of bed, turning on the lamp. The room was empty, but the shadows were still there, swirling around me. The voice was silent now, but I could feel its presence, like it was waiting for something. I ran out of my room and down the hall, not caring how loud I was. I had to get away from the shadows and the voice. I burst into my parents' room, waking them up again. This time they could see how terrified I was. My dad went to check my room, and my mom stayed with me, holding me tightly. When my dad came back, he looked shaken. He didn't say what he had seen, but I knew it wasn't good. He told me to sleep in their room for the night, and I was more than happy to do so. The next day, my parents and I talked about what had been happening. They finally believed me, and we decided to find out more about the house. My mom did some research, and she found out that Lily, the girl who wrote the journal, had disappeared many years ago. No one knew what happened to her, and her body was never found. The more we learned, the more we realized that something was very wrong with the house. We talked to some of the neighbors, and they told us strange stories about the house's past. They said that other families who had lived there also reported hearing voices and seeing shadows. Some people even claimed that the house was cursed. We didn't know what to do. My parents thought about moving, but we had just bought the house and it wasn't that easy to leave. They decided to stay for a while longer and see if things would get better, but I knew that the voice and the shadows wouldn't just go away. The final night in the house was the worst. I could feel that something was coming, something that I couldn't stop. The voice was louder than ever, and the shadows were darker, almost solid. They seemed to have a mind of their own, moving closer and closer to me. The voice spoke to me all night, telling me that I couldn't escape. "Emma, it's time. Come to me." I tried to stay awake, but I was so tired. I felt like I was being pulled into a dark place, a place where the shadows lived. I could see them wrapping around me, trying to drag me away. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. Just when I thought I couldn't take it anymore, the door to my room burst open. My parents rushed in, turning on the lights. The shadows vanished, and the voice went silent. My mom held me while my dad looked around, but there was nothing to see. I was shaking and crying, and my parents knew that we couldn't stay in the house any longer. We packed our things that very night and left. We didn't even wait for morning. We moved to a new house in a different neighborhood, far away from the old one. The new house was bright and cheerful, with no shadows or strange noises. I felt safe there, and for the first time in weeks, I was able to sleep through the night. But even though we had left the old house behind, the memories stayed with me. I still think about Lily and what happened to her. I wonder if she's still there, trapped with the voice and the shadows. I hope that someday she'll find peace. As for me, I've learned to be careful of the dark. I always sleep with a nightlight now, just in case. And if I ever hear a whispering voice calling my name, I know to stay far away. So, If you ever find yourself in a strange old house and you hear something that doesn't seem quite right, listen to your instincts. Sometimes the scariest things are the ones we can't see or explain, and sometimes it's better to leave those things behind and never look back. Good night and sleep well. My family had just moved into a new house, a place much bigger than where we lived before. It was an old house, with creaky floors and tall ceilings, but it had a certain charm that made it feel like home. My parents were excited about the extra space, and my sister Maya was thrilled to have her own room for the first time. The house came with all kinds of old furniture, including a large antique mirror that hung in the hallway. The mirror was tall, with an ornate wooden frame that was cracked and chipped in places. It looked like it had been there for years, and it added to the mysterious feel of the house. At first, everything seemed normal. We spent the first few days unpacking and settling in. My sister and I explored the house, finding little nooks and crannies where we could hide or play. The only thing that bothered me was the mirror. Every time I walked past it, I felt like someone or something was watching me. One evening, after everyone had gone to bed, I stayed up late in my room, reading a book. The house was quiet, with only the sound of the wind outside and the occasional creak of the floorboards. I was just about to turn off the light when I heard a soft noise coming from the hallway. It sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, moving closer to my room. I froze, listening intently. The footsteps stopped right outside my door. I waited, my heart pounding, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I convinced myself that it was just the house settling and went back to my book. But the next night, it happened again. This time, the footsteps were louder, and they didn't stop at my door. I heard them continue down the hallway, stopping in front of the mirror. I held my breath, waiting for what would happen next. But there was only silence. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The footsteps became more frequent, always stopping in front of the mirror. One night, I decided to find out what was going on. I stayed awake, listening carefully, and when I heard the footsteps, I quietly got out of bed and tiptoed to my door. I opened the door just a crack and peered into the hallway. There, in front of the mirror, stood a shadowy figure. It was tall and thin, with long dark hair that covered its face. It seemed to be staring into the mirror, unmoving. I wanted to scream, but I couldn't make a sound. I quickly shut the door and backed away, my heart racing. The next morning, I told my parents about the figure in the hallway, but they didn't believe me. They said I was just having nightmares and that there was nothing to worry about. But I knew what I saw, and I was determined to find out what was happening. That night, I decided to confront the figure. I waited until the house was quiet, and then I slipped out of bed and crept into the hallway. The mirror loomed in the darkness, and as I approached it, I could feel a cold chill in the air. I stopped a few feet away, staring at my reflection. At first, nothing happened. I stood there, staring into the mirror, wondering if I had imagined the whole thing. But then, slowly, the shadowy figure appeared behind me in the reflection. It was the same tall, thin shape I had seen before, with long dark hair. But this time, I could see its eyes, cold, empty eyes that seemed to pierce through me. I spun around, expecting to see the figure behind me, but there was nothing there. I turned back to the mirror, and the figure was still there, standing in the reflection, staring at me. I felt a wave of terror wash over me, and I backed away, not taking my eyes off the mirror. As I moved away, the figure stepped closer to the glass, reaching out with a pale, bony hand. I could see its fingers pressing against the surface of the mirror, as if it was trying to push through. I wanted to run, but I was frozen in place, unable to move. Just when I thought the figure would break through the mirror, it stopped. The hand slowly withdrew, and the figure faded away, disappearing into the darkness. I stood there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty mirror, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The next morning, I convinced my parents to take down the mirror. They thought I was being silly, but they agreed, and the mirror was removed and stored in the basement. After that, the footsteps stopped, and the house felt normal again. But I'll never forget the shadow in the mirror, the way it stared at me with those cold, empty eyes. Sometimes when I'm alone in the house, I can still feel its presence, as if it's waiting for the right moment to return. I don't go near mirrors anymore, and I always make sure they're covered at night. If you ever find an old mirror in an old house, be careful. You never know what might be looking back at you from the other side. My name is Emily, and I live in a small town with a large forest nearby. People in town often talk about the forest with a mix of fear and fascination. They say it's a place where strange things happen. Stories about mysterious lights, eerie sounds, and ghostly figures are common. Most people avoid the forest, especially after dark. I've heard these stories all my life, but I never really believed them. I always thought they were just tall tales meant to scare people. One day, I decided to see what the forest was really like. I packed a backpack with a flashlight, some snacks, and a bottle of water. I told my parents I was going for a walk and headed toward the forest. As I walked into the forest, the light from the sun quickly dimmed. The trees were so tall and thick that they blocked out most of the sunlight. I felt a little nervous, but I was excited too. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. The only sounds were the crunch of leaves under my feet and the occasional snap of twigs. After walking for about an hour, I came to a small clearing. In the middle of the clearing was an old, run-down cabin. It looked like it had been abandoned for many years. The wooden walls were rotting, the roof was sagging, and the windows were broken. The cabin looked like it had not been touched in a long time. I was curious, so I decided to explore the cabin. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly. Inside, the air was musty and smelled like mildew. The floorboards creaked with every step I took. The room was filled with old furniture, a dusty table with some old books, a rusty stove, and a bed with a moldy mattress. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust. On one wall there was a large mirror. It was old and covered in dust, with a cracked frame. I wiped the dust off the mirror with my sleeve and looked at my reflection. But something felt strange. When I moved, my reflection seemed to be a moment behind me. It was like it was slow to catch up with my movements. I started to feel uneasy. Just then I heard a faint whisper. It was so soft that I almost didn't hear it. It sounded like someone was calling my name. Emily. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. The whisper came again, louder this time. Emily. I looked around the cabin, but there was no one there. The cabin was empty and silent. I felt a chill run down my spine. I decided it was time to leave. I quickly walked out of the cabin and headed back toward the edge of the forest. As I made my way back, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me. I kept glancing over my shoulder, but there was nothing there. The forest felt different now, darker and more oppressive. I walked faster, my heart racing with every step. When I finally reached the edge of the forest, I was relieved. I took a deep breath and tried to calm myself down. I went home and tried to act like everything was normal, but that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the whisper and the strange mirror in the cabin. The next day I felt anxious. I kept replaying the events from the day before in my mind. I decided to stay away from the forest from then on. The stories might have some truth to them after all. For days I tried to forget about the cabin and the whisper, but every now and then I would think about it. The forest seemed even more mysterious and frightening after that experience. I wondered what else might be hidden in those dark woods. Now, whenever I hear someone talk about the forest, I can't help but feel a chill. I think about the cabin and the whispering voice. I hope I never have to go back there again. Some mysteries are better left unsolved.